Thank you, Professor Nader Hashemi. Very interesting talk indeed. He highlighted, in fact, his own commitment on the value of liberty as to be Islamic. And in fact, one interesting point which I got is that he emphasized that Muslims can actually be better, can in fact develop better with freedom compared to without freedom. And of course, the challenges of the time now relates to freedom, and Muslims relates more on the challenge of modernity. So these are all like very interesting, important points which we can explore and discuss further during the question and answer session. For the next speaker, I would like to introduce a scholar, a very important scholar, which actually require not much of introduction. Professor Chandra Muzaffar. He's the president of JUST, the International Movement for a Just World. He's definitely an important activist in the development of the civil society movements in Malaysia. He's also a prominent scholar. He has published extensively in various topics and related to matters on Islam, Muslim societies, particularly in Malaysia. Without further delay, I would like to invite Professor Chandra Muzaffar to give his talk.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Professor Nader Hashemi, Professor Clive Kessler, Zainah Anwar, friends. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Salam sejahtera, peace be with you. Let me begin by thanking the organizers for this very kind invitation. I'm not sure it's coming through properly. I agree almost completely with what Nader Hashemi has shared with you. We are on the same page on the critical points that he has raised. This is one of those occasions where I find that there is actually no disagreement. But I have done some reflection on this topic, and I'd like to perhaps share those ideas with you. I'll be brief, and then perhaps we can have a fuller discussion after that. First, an attempt to answer the question. Yes, liberty is an Islamic value. There's no dispute about it. But for me, liberty is also a Christian value. It is a Jewish value. It is a Hindu value. It is a Buddhist value. It is a Sikh value. It is a value which is embodied in all the major religious philosophies. Liberty is a God-given value. Liberty is a profoundly spiritual, moral value. This perspective is very important. It will color my brief presentation. I say that liberty or freedom is a profoundly spiritual, moral value because it is actually linked to our position as human beings. What distinguishes us, and it's not just in the Quranic tradition, what distinguishes us from the other creations of God is actually our freedom, our ability to choose, our ability to think, our ability to dream, to envision a future. The other creations, some of which are more accomplished than the human being in certain ways, they don't have that freedom and they don't exercise that freedom. This is why I say, look, it is God-given. It is a profound spiritual and moral ethic, which is why the fourth Caliph, Sayyidina Ali ibn Taib, He once said that God's most precious gift to the human being is freedom. Now, freedom from this spiritual moral perspective is perhaps not exactly the same as freedom articulated in post-Enlightenment thought. This is also, I think, a point that one has to make. In many essential areas, it would be similar, but there are also differences. For instance, for those of us who hold on to this spiritual, moral view of liberty, while we cherish the freedom to speak, to organize, to assemble, the freedom to a fair trial, all those freedoms, we're also deeply conscious of freeing our soul from greed, from cruelty, freeing ourselves from our ego, which is something that you find in all spiritual traditions. Why it's so fundamental to free ourselves from our own ego, because if you exercise the freedom too, without being conscious of the need to free yourself from those distortions within yourself, it is quite likely that your freedom too would be shaped by your inability to free yourself from the other forms of enslavements, the other encumbrances which you encounter. Now, here again, friends, as many of you would be aware, while this is something you would be able to see in all the great spiritual traditions, it is also something that was central to Platonic thought, this idea of freeing yourself from the distortions within. That is also very important. So that's a dimension that we must always keep in mind when we talk about freedom. There is another aspect which again makes freedom from a spiritual moral perspective different from the Enlightenment perspective, if you like. And I'm using it in very general terms, the Enlightenment perspective. Restraint within the post-Enlightenment perspective of human rights and human freedoms and so on is seen as something which is more often than not an imposition. Restraint. It takes the form of certain laws, it takes the form of certain rules and regulations, but it's seen as something that comes from outside. But in the spiritual moral tradition, restraint is actually part of freedom. In fact, restraint is vital for freedom to flourish. That there has to be a sense of restraint. There has to be a certain concern, more than a concern, a commitment to the freedom of the other. Your right to exercise freedom, you recognize the freedom of the other, his rights, her rights, and that would require restraint on your part in pursuing your own freedom to its zenith, because you're very much aware of the freedoms of the others. You know there is a need to exercise restraint. So there are these dimensions which are very important. Restraint as something which is inherent in freedom. This notion of freedom related to ethics and values. For instance, in the Quran, it is very clear that if you exercise freedom, like as it's stated in Surah Ali Imran, verse 103, 104, you exercise freedom, but it is a freedom to do good. It is not a freedom to do evil. So there is a clear ethical notion of freedom, which I think is also important. If you see freedom from, again, in very crude terms, from, say, John Stuart Mill's perspective, freedom is freedom, full stop. This distinction between freedom to do good and freedom to avoid evil, to fight against evil, that is something which is found in all the great spiritual traditions. There is a strong ethical dimension to it. I think those of us who are fighting for liberty, for freedom, we should be aware of this. We should be aware of these other dimensions. And when we talk about fighting for liberty, it is this more holistic, and I would consider it much more holistic, notion of freedom, rooted in this spiritual moral ethic that we are talking about. This is what we are pursuing. With that as the backdrop, let me look at the situation that confronts many of us. Right through history, this notion of freedom has been transgressed. I can't think of any society where we've enjoyed a notion of freedom, the practice of freedom, that is free of various inadequacies. Those inadequacies and shortcomings have always been there in every society, from the smallest human community to huge human communities. There have been these shortcomings. And I don't want to single out the Muslim world, because what is happening within the Muslim world and what has happened within the Muslim world in the past is also been happening in other societies. They're not peculiar to the Muslim world. Sometimes there is this tendency amongst many of us to give the impression that somehow these things are peculiar to the Muslim world. They are not. Nonetheless, when I look at different forms of governance within the Muslim world today, there are perhaps at least 4 modes of governance within Muslim societies, and in all of them, you find that freedom is a challenge. It is a challenge. For instance, you have had absolute monarchies. You still have some absolute monarchies today in the Muslim world. And if you look at religious communities, I think we have more absolute monarchies than others, absolute monarchies, where rulers exercise total power. There are also military dictatorships. Many Muslim countries, you still have some form of military dictatorship. And again, freedom is a major challenge in these societies. A third form of governance is something which has been there for a few decades now in their present manifestation. These are societies governed by religious elites. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 was the most obvious in modern times, but we had before that, Saudi Arabia actually, and a few other religious dictatorships. So that's another form of governance. I wouldn't say that this is peculiar to the Muslim world, because if you look at what's been happening in the last few decades, Nepal before the revolution had a religious form of government. And if you look at India today, I think a type of religiosity is creeping into administration of a very vile type in the name of a distorted type of Hinduism. So that phenomenon is there. And perhaps some people would argue that if you look at Myanmar, the way in which religion is being harnessed for certain purposes, there is also an attempt to distort Buddhism. So we have that challenge as far as religion is concerned and religious types of administration. And in the Muslim world, as many of us know, this challenge is perhaps undergoing a transformation itself, and this is why we are beginning to see all sorts of variations in different Muslim societies, partly because of modernity, partly because of power itself and the way in which power is manipulated. And it's something which we have to grapple with. A fourth example would be civilian elected governments in Muslim countries. There are more and more of them today. The most significant would, of course, be Indonesia, of a Muslim country which has an elected government, civilian. Remarkable achievement, actually, considering its history and its background. And it has sustained itself, actually, in spite of everything. After a few decades, and you still see some promising signs that democracy in Indonesia is working. Civilian democracy is working. But for all of us, in all these societies, the challenge would be how we can enhance and expand freedom in the broad, deep sense that we talked about. And each society, I think, will have to work out its own mechanics. The modalities will differ from place to place, from state to state. Let me also add very quickly that we should not just be thinking of nation states when we look at this challenge of different forms of government and freedom. There are also global elites. You don't have a global government, but you have various aspects of global governance, which is a different thing. Various aspects of global governance, no global government, but if you look at global governance in its various expressions, and you look at global elites, you also have a very authoritarian system. It is very, very authoritarian in terms of dominance, control, and the way in which people have to struggle for freedom and pay for this struggle with their dear lives. I'm reminded of this yet again in the last week or so because of what's been happening in Palestine. You have a people fighting for their freedom. You have another group of people who have established a state also as part of their yearning for freedom, their right to establish a state. And you have this clash, this collision that is taking place. Though the present crisis is much more than this clash that has been there for quite a long while. So clashes of identities, aspirations, in the name of freedom, it's going to go on. And at the global level, it's going to be a major challenge, partly because you don't have a single center of power to refer to. This is something that we must reflect upon, because one of the reasons why one has been able to fight against dictatorships is because there is a locus of power. And you can concentrate upon that locus of power, whether it is the Iranian people against the Iranian dictatorship, 1979, or if you look at Indonesia, or any one of these countries. But at the global level, you have got global governance, but power is more diffused and dispersed. So the struggle becomes much more difficult at that level. But nonetheless, there is a challenge, and there is a struggle against dictatorship at the global level, where the Security Council is controlled, General Assembly to some extent is controlled, many of the global institutions are controlled by certain forces, and even if some of those forces are declining, the very fact that they are declining has also become a challenge, because as they decline, you find that they become even more aggressive in wanting to perpetuate their power, which is to be expected. And this is, I think, the juncture that we're at. Friends, the question is, how do we deal with all this? As I said a while ago, every society will have to come up with its own solutions, because the struggle for freedom is something that is conditioned by context, by history. Nonetheless, one could argue, if one may, that what is most fundamental in this struggle against dominance, control at the domestic level, at the international level, is developing a culture which would be able to withstand the power of elites. In the ultimate analysis, the struggle is against elites of whatever type, religious elites, civilian elites, military elites. That's what the struggle is all about. It's for space, it is for your rights against these elites. One can talk about laws, one can talk about changes and all the rest of it in this struggle. But what is most important, I think, is developing a culture which can withstand the power of elites. A culture where people would instinctively defend freedom and equality and justice and compassion and all the other values which are worth defending. It is creating that culture that is the real challenge. Because you can have groups coming up here and there, an opposition party, you place some hope upon a certain political party, or you can hope for some changes to certain laws, certain ways of governance, but in the ultimate analysis, there's be something much deeper. And that deeper process is actually linked to culture. Values that have become deeply embedded in a society, in a people. One could argue, and this is my conclusion, how are you going to develop this? When you have totalitarian systems, when you have absolute control, how are you going to develop this culture? Now, what is amazing is this. In spite of totalitarianism, which is total control, in spite of dominance and authoritarian power, right through history, you find that alternatives have emerged. Sometimes in these very societies, these alternatives have taken firmer root. So I don't think this should deter us. If you look at our own situation in Malaysia, for instance, what we are facing is actually nothing compared to what others have had to face right through history in terms of the abuse of power, in terms of the way in which suppression and oppression express themselves. So we have to take heart that it is possible to bring about change through the family, through little communities, relationships, the education system, alternatives that you try to set up. Change will take place, and you'll be able to instill values that are different from the dominant values. You'll be able to bring about that change. This has happened right through history, and that for us is what gives us hope for the future, in trying to strengthen liberty, in trying to give freedom real meaning in societies like ours. And in this struggle, I think once again, for many of us, especially societies like ours, we try to harness the most precious gifts that we have from our own spiritual traditions. Because these are traditions that mean a lot to people. We'll have to try to harness these gifts. And I find that in the midst of all that has been happening, if one links oneself with God consciousness, not necessarily religion consciousness, one has to make a distinction between the two. I think most people, we are loyal to religion, we worship religion. We don't really worship God. We worship religion, we don't worship God. It's part of the problem. If we could link ourselves with God consciousness in the real sense and understand basics from that perspective, why we are here, our creation, the purpose of life, and the role of freedom. How precious freedom is that we can set aside, at least for our own struggle, we can set aside the dictates from religious authorities, from political leaders and all the rest of it, because we know that there is something beyond religion. And loyalty to God actually transcends religion. That is something that requires a different discourse, but let's try to keep that in mind as we grapple with the challenge of liberty as an Islamic value. Thank you.